What if I told you that while the Pentagon spends $886 billion a year scanning the skies over the South China Sea, China has been quietly planting strategic routes less than 100 miles from American soil? Not with warships, not with fighter jets, but with something far more subtle, far more effective, and far more difficult to counter. This isn't speculation. This is happening right now, and the speed at which it's unfolding should genuinely alarm you. Most people think of military expansion the old-fashioned way: bases, aircraft carriers, missile silos. But here's what mainstream analysis gets completely wrong about China's strategy in the Western Hemisphere. Beijing isn't building a traditional military base. It's building something better. Something that doesn't trigger Article 5, doesn't make front-page headlines, and doesn't give Washington a clean target to rally against. What China is constructing across Latin America, the Caribbean, and critical maritime choke points is a network, a layered infrastructure of ports, space monitoring stations, and dual-use facilities that can flip from civilian to military application with a single phone call. And I'm going to break down exactly how they're doing it through 3 systems that, when you see them working together, will completely change how you understand the modern arms race. Let me start with the first system, because this is the one hiding in plain sight. System 1, the port strategy, controlling the choke points without firing a shot. In 2023, a report surfaced from U.S. Southern Command that flagged something extraordinary. Chinese state-owned enterprises now hold operating stakes or outright control of port facilities at 97 locations across Latin America and the Caribbean. Not 50, not 70, 97. That number should stop you cold. Now, why ports? Here's what most people miss. A deep-water port isn't just a place where container ships dock. It's an intelligence platform. It's a logistics node. It's a potential staging area. And critically, under international maritime law, a commercially operated port gives the operating nation a legal gray zone, a space where military vessels can refuel, resupply, and gather electronic intelligence under the cover of routine commercial activity. When I spoke to a retired naval strategist who spent 22 years at Southcom, he put it to me bluntly. He said, "We spent the Cold War worrying about Soviet submarines. We should have been worrying about who controls the cranes." That line stuck with me because it captures the entire shift in doctrine. Take the Chancay megaport in Peru. This is a $3.5 billion deep-water facility, majority owned by COSCO Shipping, a company whose board answers directly to the Chinese Communist Party. Chancay sits on the Pacific coast, roughly 80 kilometers north of Lima, and when it becomes fully operational, it will be the largest port in South America. The Peruvian government celebrated it as an economic miracle. Washington barely mentioned it. But let me show you the numbers that actually matter. Chancay's depth clearance is designed for vessels up to 18,000 TEU capacity. For context, that's large enough to accommodate every class of Chinese naval auxiliary ship currently in service. The port's approach channel has been dredged to 17.8 meters, deeper than what any purely commercial operation in the region requires. And the facility includes a special economic zone spanning 1,600 hectares with restricted access and independent security arrangements. Does that sound like a trade hub to you? Here's the uncomfortable pattern. COSCO doesn't just operate Chancay, it holds stakes in port facilities in Panama, both the Atlantic and Pacific entrances to the canal. It operates terminals in Kingston, Jamaica, which sits directly astride the primary shipping lane between the Gulf of Mexico and the eastern seaboard. And it has a growing presence in the Bahamas, roughly 310 kilometers from the coast of Florida. If you want to understand what strategic encirclement looks like in the 21st century, just look at a map of COSCO's port investments and draw lines between them. What you'll see isn't a business plan, it's a containment arc. And it's pointed directly at the United States. Now, ports alone don't complete the picture, not even close. The second system China has deployed in America's backyard is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss the scale of what's being constructed. Because this system doesn't move cargo. It moves data, signals, and surveillance. Let me show you. So here's the second system at work, and this one operates in a domain most people never think about when they hear the words military expansion. It doesn't involve steel or concrete. It involves something far more powerful. electromagnetic spectrum dominance, and space-based surveillance, deployed from facilities built on sovereign Latin American soil with the full cooperation of host governments. System 2, the Space and Signals Network, Eyes and Ears, across the hemisphere. In 2017, China opened a deep space tracking station in Neuquén, Argentina. It sits on 200 hectares of Patagonian scrubland, operated by the China Satellite Launch and Tracking Control General, which reports directly to the People's Liberation Army's Strategic Support Force. Let that sink in. A PLA-affiliated entity is running a fully operational space monitoring facility in the Southern Hemisphere, roughly 9,000 kilometers from Beijing, but only 5,400 kilometers from the U.S. border. Argentina's government at the time was told the facility would be used exclusively for civilian space exploration. The agreement was signed with a 50-year lease. 50 years. And here's the detail that should make every analyst in Washington uncomfortable. The Argentine government has no right to inspect the facility without prior Chinese approval. An independent investigation by Argentine journalists in 2023 revealed that the station's 35-meter parabolic antenna has capabilities far beyond what any civilian deep space program requires. It can track objects in low Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, and deep space simultaneously. A senior defense consultant I spoke with in Buenos Aires, someone who advises multiple South American governments on security policy, told me off the record, "Everyone knows what that facility really does. Nobody wants to say it publicly because the economic relationship with Beijing is too important." That single sentence explains the entire geopolitical trap China has engineered across the region. But Neuquén isn't alone. Let me show you what this actually means at scale. China operates or has access to satellite ground stations and tracking facilities in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Brazil. Its Beidou satellite navigation system, the Chinese alternative to GPS, now has ground augmentation stations across at least 6 Latin American countries. Why does this matter? Because Beidou doesn't just provide navigation. It provides encrypted military-grade communications and precision targeting data. Every ground station that enhances Beidou's accuracy in the Western Hemisphere is, functionally, a piece of military infrastructure. In 2022, the PLA's Strategic Support Force conducted what it described as routine calibration exercises using the Neuquén facility and at least 2 other ground stations in South America. U.S. Space Command detected anomalous signal activity during a 72-hour window that coincided with the repositioning of 3 Chinese reconnaissance satellites over the Caribbean. Was it a test, a message, or simply standard procedure? Here's what nobody tells you. The United States has exactly 1 dedicated space monitoring facility in South America. A radar installation in Western Australia feeds data on the Southern Hemisphere, supplemented by limited sensor coverage from a facility in Diego Garcia. China now has more persistent ground-based space surveillance capability in the Western Hemisphere than the United States has in the Eastern Hemisphere. Read that again. The signals dimension goes even deeper. Huawei, despite being banned from 5G networks in the United States, the UK, and Australia, has built or is building 4G and 5G telecommunications infrastructure in 21 Latin American and Caribbean nations. That's not a statistic I'm rounding. 21 confirmed deployments. In countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, and Cuba, Huawei hasn't just built the networks. It's trained the technical staff, maintained the back-end systems, and in several cases, provided the surveillance software used by those governments for domestic monitoring. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because what comes next connects these 2 systems to a third force that's operating at a level most Western governments still refuse to acknowledge publicly. Now think about what these 2 systems look like working in concert. The ports give China physical logistics nodes, places where ships, equipment, and personnel can move through the hemisphere under commercial cover. The Space and Signals Network gives China persistent surveillance and communications capability across the entire region. Together, they form the skeleton of something that looks remarkably like forward military infrastructure, without ever being formally declared as such. But a skeleton needs muscle, and that brings us to the third system, the one that turns passive infrastructure into active power projection. This is the part that should genuinely concern every strategist at the Pentagon because it involves something the United States has historically monopolized in the Western Hemisphere and is now losing for the first time in over a century. The third system is the one that transforms everything I've just described from a theoretical concern into an operational reality, and it revolves around something the United States has taken for granted in this hemisphere since the Monroe Doctrine: exclusive security relationships with regional militaries. System 3. The military relationship pipeline. Buying loyalty, one contract at a time. Here's what makes people uncomfortable. China is now the primary or secondary arms supplier to at least 11 nations in Latin America and the Caribbean. Not economic partner, not trade ally, arms supplier. The country selling weapons, training officers, conducting joint exercises, and embedding military advisors across a region that Washington has treated as its uncontested strategic backyard for 200 years. Let me show you the numbers that matter. Between 2010 and 2023, Chinese arms exports to Latin America totaled approximately $2.4 billion. That figure sounds modest compared to U.S. defense spending. But here's the critical context. These aren't fighter jet deals or aircraft carrier contracts. These are precisely targeted sales of the equipment that builds dependency. Armored personnel carriers to Venezuela, radar systems to Ecuador, military transport aircraft to Bolivia, patrol vessels to Trinidad and Tobago, drone technology to at least 7 countries across the region. And drones are where this story takes a turn that most Western media has completely ignored. China's Wing-Lung 2 armed drone, a direct competitor to the American MQ-9 Reaper, has been exported to multiple countries globally. But what analysts at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute flagged in their 2023 database is that Chinese-manufactured surveillance and reconnaissance drones are now operational in the military inventories of Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, and reportedly Mexico. These aren't commercial quadcopters. These are military-grade platforms with synthetic aperture radar, signals intelligence packages, and endurance profiles exceeding 20 hours. When I was researching this topic, a defense attaché stationed in a South American capital, someone I've known for years, told me something that crystallized the entire problem. He said, "The Americans offer us equipment we can't afford, with conditions we can't meet, delivered on timelines we can't wait for. The Chinese show up with a competitive product, flexible financing, and zero questions about human rights. Who would you buy from?" That's not an endorsement. That's a structural reality. And it's a reality the Pentagon has been catastrophically slow to address. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Every arms sale China completes in the region comes with strings that are invisible to the public but deeply consequential. Training packages mean Chinese military personnel embedded in host nation defense ministries. Maintenance contracts mean long-term technical dependency. Spare parts agreements mean that operational readiness depends on Beijing's willingness to supply. Over 15 to 20 years, these relationships don't just create customers. They create aligned militaries. And the training dimension is accelerating at a pace that should alarm anyone paying attention. In 2012, China hosted approximately 200 Latin American military officers for professional education and training programs. By 2022, that number had risen to over 3,700 in a single year. That's an 150% increase in 1 decade. These officers return to their home countries having spent months or years studying at PLA institutions, building personal relationships with Chinese counterparts, and absorbing Chinese strategic doctrine. Compare that to the trajectory of U.S. military training programs in the region, which have remained essentially flat or declined over the same period due to budget constraints, political controversies, and bureaucratic inertia. Now connect all 3 systems and look at what emerges. China controls or influences critical port infrastructure across 97 locations in the hemisphere. It operates space surveillance and telecommunications networks that provide persistent intelligence coverage across the entire region. And it is systematically building security relationships with regional militaries through arms sales, training pipelines, and embedded technical support. Does that look like a trade strategy to you? Does that look like a country focused on selling consumer electronics and buying soybeans? Most people think China's interests in Latin America are purely economic. But here's what's really happening. Beijing is constructing what military planners call an anti-access architecture. Not to invade, not to occupy, but to ensure that in any future conflict with the United States, China has the ability to complicate, disrupt, and deny American freedom of action in its own hemisphere. And that changes the calculus of everything from Taiwan to the South China Sea. Let me pull this all together and show you exactly why. Let me pull this together because when you see these three systems operating as a single integrated strategy, the picture that emerges is unlike anything the United States has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Except this time, there are no missiles to photograph, no ships to blockade, and no single moment of confrontation that forces a decisive response. That's the genius of what I call the invisible perimeter doctrine. China hasn't built a military base in America's backyard. It's done something far more strategically sophisticated. It's built the connective tissue, the ports, the sensors, the relationships that would allow it to activate military-grade capabilities across the Western Hemisphere without ever formally crossing the threshold that triggers an American response. Every individual piece looks civilian. Every individual agreement looks commercial. Every individual training exchange looks diplomatic. But assembled together, they form a coherent architecture of strategic encirclement that operates below the threshold of conventional deterrence. And here's what this actually means for the future. I see three scenarios unfolding over the next decade, and none of them are comfortable. Scenario 1. The slow squeeze. China continues expanding its port network, deepens its military relationships, and enhances its signals infrastructure at the current pace. By 2035, Beijing has operational influence over the majority of critical maritime choke points in the Western Hemisphere. The United States doesn't lose a war. It loses the ability to project power efficiently in its own region. Supply chains, naval deployments, and intelligence operations all become more expensive, slower, and more contested. America doesn't collapse. It erodes. Scenario 2. The Taiwan trigger. A crisis in the Taiwan Strait escalates to the point where the United States commits naval forces to the Western Pacific. At that exact moment, China activates its Latin American network, not militarily, but informationally and logistically. Port access for U.S. vessels becomes complicated by sudden maintenance shutdowns at Costco-operated terminals. Satellite tracking stations in Argentina and Brazil provide real-time intelligence on U.S. military movements in the Atlantic. Regional governments, dependent on Chinese arms and trade, decline to offer basing rights or overflight permissions. The United States discovers that fighting a war 7,000 miles away is exponentially harder when your own hemisphere isn't secure. Scenario 3. The awakening. Washington finally recognizes the invisible perimeter doctrine for what it is and launches a comprehensive counter-strategy. This would require something the U.S. government has historically been terrible at: patient, long-term infrastructure investment in Latin America combined with genuine diplomatic engagement that doesn't treat the region as an afterthought. It would mean competing with Chinese port investments dollar for dollar. It would mean offering arms packages that are actually affordable and deliverable. It would mean treating Latin American nations as sovereign partners rather than subordinate allies. Which scenario do I think is most likely? Honestly, a combination of the first two, and here's why. The structural incentives in Washington actively prevent Scenario 3. Defense budgets are optimized for great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. The State Department's Western Hemisphere Bureau is chronically underfunded. And politically, no American president wins votes by announcing a 30-year port infrastructure program in Peru. Meanwhile, Beijing operates on planning horizons that make Washington's election cycles look like a strategic disability. The Chansey port wasn't conceived last year. It was planned in 2011. The New Ken space station wasn't improvised. It was negotiated over a decade. The military training pipeline didn't emerge spontaneously. It was built officer by officer, year by year, with the kind of strategic patience that the American system simply cannot replicate under its current structure. A former NSC official told me something I haven't been able to shake. He said, "We keep looking for the moment China becomes a threat in our hemisphere. We keep waiting for the red line, but China's entire strategy is designed to ensure that moment never comes. Because by the time we recognize what's happened, it's already infrastructure, not aggression, and you can't sanction a shipping crane." That's the world we're entering. One where military power isn't measured only in carrier groups and stealth bombers, but in port leases, satellite ground stations, and officer training rosters. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to see your answers in the comments. At what point does commercial infrastructure become military infrastructure? Where is that line? And has China already crossed it? If this changed how you think about the global power shift, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because this story is accelerating, and I promise you, what's coming next is even bigger than what I've shown you today.